Well, it's a beautiful fall evening, and just thought I'd take a walk and explain why capitalism sucks and what we could do about that. And I've talked about it a little bit in some previous videos, but today we're going to look more succinctly at the subject. And so, first of all, we have to understand, capitalism is a set of rules in words, you could say, a discussion. It's a discussion about how to organize money, and money itself is a discussion about human energy, as we covered in the last video. So we're really taking something, again, money is a relatively etheric, symbolic set of concepts, and then when we talk about something like capitalism, it's a whole combination of symbolic concepts. And so before we get into too much, let's just look at some of the basics of capitalism. The idea of capitalism is that there's several major aspects. One is the flow of money. So we'll call that cash flow. And then there's this idea that the flow of money, there's a value to that. So for example, let's say that you put your money in an interest-bearing bank account. The interest is a flow, and the bank account itself is an asset of some sort. It's like a pool. So just like you might have a lake, which is standing water, and then you've got a river, which is flowing water, we have those same concepts when it comes to capitalism. And this is why people invest in businesses, just as we kind of wander around the subject. Most businesses, when they start, they don't make any money, right? So they have no value. But as they develop cash flow, crossing the street here, the more cash flow that runs through a business, the more valuable the business is itself. Now, it's important to understand also that capitalism was an outgrowth of feudalism. So yes, it's not perfect by any stretch. And in the end, if we look at every kind of monetary system in the world, they are also not perfect. And why is that? Because human beings are a work in progress. So let's look at the major flaws that are expressed really boldly in capitalism. So the 3 or 4 things that are really the worst of it are the tendency to exploit people who are weaker than you, the workers. So whether that's slavery or, just, not looking out after the people who are producing the goods and services. And the next problem is environmental degradation. And that's another, it comes from trying to increase profits. When you increase profits, what are you doing? You're trying to increase the cash flow. So the externalization of the real costs. And like right now, we've got a really big problem because like in the US with the current health issues, the people who have money are buying a lot more delivered goods. And so Amazon.com, they're delivering stuff night and day, and all these things come in plastic bags or now paper bags. But this just is massively entering the waste stream. And of course, they have no direct accountability for that part of their business. And if they did, they would make a lot less profit, and the valuation of Amazon would go down if they actually were responsible for this massive waste flow. And I don't really want to pick on them. It's just an easy target. Pretty much every corporation runs on this kind of abuse of nature and trying to pass the buck. In this case, trying to take this stream of waste and just say, well, the government's going to somehow do it, and the governments don't do it. Where does that stuff end up? It ends up in the ocean, trillions of pounds of waste. And that's where most of the stuff is ending up. We're just destroying the planet with this habit of externalizing environmental costs. And then what's left from there? The tendency to create monopolies and consolidate power, and then really take whatever's bad about capitalism, and then, then that becomes extreme once there's no competition. Okay, so now this is a little bit of a trick I'm doing here, because all these things happened before capitalism. Look at all the famous tyrants of history. They were there before capitalism. Capitalism may be an outgrowth of all that. You see, the thing is, when we look at capitalism and blame it, the ism, we blame that for the problem and think somehow we're going to solve that by creating some different rule set. Well, as soon as we think that we're going to change things by creating a new rule set, we have to remember, where did these rules come from? Originally from the kings. They ruled through, authoritarian power by fiat. And then capitalism is essentially a power-sharing agreement. And so the rise of the merchant class and essentially the kings agreed to allow other holders of wealth to organize themselves in this way. So if you look at how kings got power, just by basically dominating everybody else, and then this kind of agreement that power would be shared by those who were aggregating wealth through commerce, as opposed to, say, before that, things were much more agrarian. And so capitalism actually was a power-sharing agreement, but it wasn't universal by any means. So who made the rules of capitalism? The people at the top. And if we're at the bottom, which is mostly everybody, 99% or whatever, we're not in the rule-making class. So we think that if we can somehow get those rules organized, but now as soon as we do that, now we're back into the realm of politics. And again, politics is basically just another way that the wealthy and powerful solve issues amongst themselves. And I don't want to be too defeatist. The better, what we might think of in the West as the more free societies, have a better means. They're more willing to let the general public determine how things are governed. But in the end, we're still dealing with this basic hierarchy we described in the last video of humanity's tendency to try to dominate others for their own personal gain. So that's really part of the challenge. When you say capitalism is bad, it's not so true. What's really bad is human beings have a nasty side. We have a nasty side to ourselves, and it gets expressed no matter what financial system we overlay on it. So really, if we want to look at what's more powerful, is that the financial systems are much more of a reflection of our own internal states. If people in a culture have a tendency toward peace, they tend to create peaceful systems. If people in a culture have a tendency toward violence, then they tend to create rigid, hierarchical legal structures. But in every case, the law is generally designed to benefit the people who create it. If large groups of people can be organized to create law, those laws do have some longevity. And the challenge that we have, especially in the US and maybe elsewhere, is that the people who are the most disenfranchised can least afford to organize. They're busy looking for food and shelter and medical care. So they don't necessarily have the free time to engage in long political battles. And because of that, politics as well as capitalism just keeps tending to move toward, consolidation of power, just like every other system before. So what's different now? What's different now is that more and more people, and I see this more and more with younger people, they're really being able to distinguish the egoic self, the survival mode, right? This quest for power is just survival mode run amok, where, no amount of material is enough. If I have one car, I need 2 cars. And if I got 2 cars, I need 4 cars. So this constant race to try to satisfy something that's fundamentally not satisfiable through mass accumulation. Obviously, if you're in poverty, you have some wealth, that's a big difference. But at a certain point, there's so many studies on this, marginal happiness after a certain point doesn't scale with marginal increases in wealth. And as many of the teachers say, some of the most unhappy people are the wealthiest. Why? Because they always thought if they had more money, they'd be happy. And then they won. They won the race, and they're still unhappy. And that's a cataclysmic moment in their personal existence. Why? If you think you're going to be happy once you're wealthy, and then you get wealthy and you're still not happy, then you're in a crisis. So what are we doing differently here? Vegans, first of all, they've got, in general, vegans have really nice body chemistry. They're just happier. And of course, we're all upset when we look at the people who are, still out there causing the violence. But we have to have some compassion, because except for a handful of people who were born into vegan families, all of us were born into this system. The ignorance doesn't really have a beginning. So we're just really working to end the ignorance. And so, yes, it can be very dramatic to realize when you kind of wake up into what's really going on in the animal exploiting industries. It's ghastly. So I don't want to take anything away from that. But again, my being upset all day, my being depressed all day, that doesn't help either me or the animals. So, and my own happiness actually is my own choice. That's what all the Eastern traditions expressly teach, experientially teach, that our own state is our own choice. So if we have capitalism as a tool, right? There's more leverage in capitalism to make change than there was in feudal systems where everything is just brutal. And of course today you can look around the world at the most brutalitarian cultures, and there people have the least latitude to create a new culture. So how do we fix capitalism? Well, we get engaged. And the things that are so interesting, and it's unfortunate, I'm sorry to see Elon Musk doing animal testing for his artificial intelligence company. That's a disappointment. Tesla's pretty much weeded out the use of animals in their manufacturing. That was actually, their agenda. They don't use leather seats, and they actually document these things. They actually document the use, what's left. So how they didn't get it, and they're doing testing on, and I don't want to have to say this each time, I may, but Elon Musk has modeled certain kinds of behaviors that we can look at in our vegan businesses. So here we're saying, okay, capitalism, externalizing the costs of environmental degradation, that's more profitable, theoretically. And one thing that Tesla is doing is they spend large amounts of money on doing extensive internal environmental audits. And you can read these audits online. And so they're really tracking their whole supply chain and looking at ways to minimize the damage. And eventually the goal is to come up with basically a closed loop for materials. That's a ways off. But the fact that they have this and they publicize it at their shareholder meetings, and word is getting out. And so to a customer now of their product, what other companies consider as a cost, that's actually a marketing asset for a company like Tesla. So the fact that they're holding a way higher standard than the government minimums, that puts them in a totally different league than every other car company on the planet in the eyes of the customer. And so that has value. And so this is what happens when cultures transition. We're transitioning into an era where taking care of the environment is, like, it's urgent. It was urgent when I was a kid, and it's more urgent now, even. And as a result, these kinds of things are going to be highly influential in terms of how the money flows. So we're in this really interesting inversion potential where companies that treat the environment way better actually will make way more money. The exact opposite of what we've been told to believe by the existing dominant paradigm. And this same thing can be applied to workers. We've been treating workers in essentially as a broad culture. We've looked at workers, it's like, oh, if only we could do our business but not have to pay anybody to do the work. This is a really absurd notion, and of course the most profitable companies are always the best places to work. And yet that seems to always be missed. But as vegan entrepreneurs and vegan financial leaders, we do have the choice to design companies for higher ideals. Profit sharing, another thing that Tesla does, that also, oddly, Microsoft did this. Every employee is a shareholder. So you might even say that, Tesla, I don't know if Microsoft still does it, but they certainly did it in the beginning. But at this moment, Tesla's a substantial employee-owned company. And, through the nature of capitalism, it turns out Musk owns the majority, or he's the largest shareholder, not the majority shareholder, but he owns quite a lot of stock. Okay, that's the topic for another video. And again, there's some people say, well, that's right or wrong. We'll explore that. But he actually sees that providing capital to the employees, in itself, that one action helps align the interests, as opposed to them being kind of a chattel, some kind of a, fungible, easily, something of exchange, and by objectifying the staff is not what we want, right? As soon as you objectify another human being, then you're fine with enslaving them, treating them poorly, giving them bad working conditions, not giving them health care, all that stuff. So giving them ownership, as a matter of fact, changes the whole cultural dynamic of that enterprise. And here we have literally, this will be another video as well, but there's just trillions of dollars of market to be transformed by the vegan ethic. So we get to design the companies to the higher standard and practice that and gain. I guess really what I'm saying is that the way to transform capitalism is to use capitalism to build companies that are non-exploitive in their design, and they have to be designed. Most of the companies that we look at on Wall Street were designed decades ago, and so we're living with an old cultural footprint, and we need to create a new culture. So we need to create new companies, which we can do, fortunately, because of the good parts of capitalism. All right, what about monopolistic tendencies? That has a lot to do with the way finance is practiced right now. The difference between startups and mature companies is that startups find it very difficult to get access to capital, whereas mature companies, once they reach a certain threshold, there's just money floating around trying to get into those companies. I think I'm just going to walk back because there's a road up ahead. It's going to be noisy. So you can see that whoever's bigger tends to get more and more money, and part of this is because, you know, the larger the investor, the less risk they're willing to take, the more risk averse they are. So, you know, if a lot of money is floating around in the United States in endowment funds and pension funds, the U.S. state pension funds manage about $4 trillion of assets. Job number one for them is don't lose any money. So they're not looking to, so that's a lot of cash that's not going to go into raw startups. And that's really the challenge. So the bigger pools of capital become more and more risk averse, and as a result, the bigger companies that have a bigger and longer track record get much easier access to capital. Now here, this is something Vegan Launch is doing now to moderate this effect. We're, you know, in the current system, only a handful of companies actually really ever get capitalized. Most entrepreneurs just fail, and same with vegan entrepreneurs. And failure to capitalize, according to the Small Business Administration in the U.S., is really one of the number one factors that lead to business failure: poor access to capital. Again, thankfully, the U.S. and most other westernized countries decided that things needed to be easier. It needed to be easier for startups to access capital. So Vegan Launch it really came to being. I went vegan the same year that the U.S. something called regulation crowdfunding was passed. And after about a year being vegan, and I just thought, wow, you know, this is really the tool set I've been looking for to help spread the risk really far and wide. So, you know, it's one thing for some, you know, big endowment, if they put, you know, they're allocating $1 billion to some investment pool, that goes, if that thing flops, that's $1 billion. But when you use these new financial rules that were given to us by the powerful people, thank you for that, at least doing that. Thank you for at least doing that. You know? And now there's a new measure of freedom of speech to raise capital, which is also speech, right? The money is capital, and now we have the freedom to talk about that money more freely. So we've been empowered by our cultures around the Western world to more freely aggregate capital and distribute that risk very widely. So with these new crowdfunding laws, there are opportunities for people to invest as little as $100. You know, you get 1,000 people at $100, that's $100,000. You can start just about anything with money like that. Uber was started with $200,000. So that's 2,000 people at $100 a piece, and you can start Uber if you want. And yet, the starting of Uber, that was basically some savings from the two founders. So if that went under, they were both out, you know, roughly $100,000 a piece. That's a pretty big hit. But when you're able to distribute the risk this way, then you can really start a whole lot of companies with no one investor taking a huge stake in any one company. And as I've said before, and I'll say again, vegans alone control about $2 trillion in the public stock market. So using the fact that there's a lot of money and spreading that risk far and wide means that we can start a lot of companies. Starting a lot of companies is a good antidote, not an anecdote. It's a good antidote to monopolistic activities. And this is why I've said before, and I'll say it again. People might say, well, we want a big vegan fast food chain. Great, let's do that. Let's have a restaurant chain with 1,000 vegan restaurants. Why not? All kind of the same, you know, franchise style. And then let's also have 1,000 independently owned vegan restaurants. Why not? So we can create a very diverse ecosystem of entrepreneurship using these techniques and the wealth that we have accumulated, those at the top, shall I say. When I say the top, the investor class. And the investor class is everybody from the ultra wealthy to people who have a few $100s in their portfolios. It's still the top. In the US especially, you know, the bottom 50% or more have pretty much no savings, not to mention nothing in the stock market. But through my research, and you know, I keep finding this agreed on in the general press, about a third of all the money in the stock market is held by people who are not millionaires, so $1 million or below. That's a lot of people. That's millions of people. And then the next third is held by people who have 1 to 10 million in their portfolios, and that's still a lot of people. And then the last third is held by people who have 10 million or above, and that's a relatively small number of people, but because of the way finance has been done for the past 90 years or more, those are really the only people who've been deciding what kind of culture we're going to build. So with Vegan Launch, we're bringing that decision about what kind of culture we're going to do by helping put the entrepreneurs directly in touch with the entire investor class, not just the very top of the pyramid. And the more we do this, the more we can, you know, Vegan Launch itself, my intent with all this is that the more we do this, and the more that we demonstrate that we can do large and successful and, you know, all kinds of cool business projects that inspire investors, now we get to compete directly for we'll call it for the hearts and minds of the investor class. And that's a way that we can transform the whole financial sector toward getting in touch with ethics. Whether we agree with their ethics or not, right now most financial enterprises operate they themselves think that they're neutral. There's no such thing as ethically neutral. I might disagree with your ethics. There's not a single person on the planet that is ethically neutral. It's not really possible. So what we're really talking about is veganism is essentially a competition in the field of ethics. And when we define our ethics very clearly, and we start doing more and more financial transactions and building more and more companies that share these ethics, now we're creating a real value distinction between the other financial leaders in our culture who run capitalism, right? So again, just like Tesla is creating a value distinction by having this in-depth environmental report on their business that's not required by any law, but it does create a very unique value proposition for them compared to any of the other car makers. That inspires a fairly substantial part of the customer market as well as the investor market. So we're trying to lead through inspiration as opposed to oppression. That's in the end what this is really all about. Is can we create an inspired culture, or do we have to keep relying on authoritarian tendencies? And where it starts is all of us working together, getting together, building a community of investors and entrepreneurs, and trying to make sure that everybody is really served, that their needs are met, and that they're really able to work together to build the kind of future we want for ourselves and our children. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and look forward to seeing you in the next one.